Oh, my favorite part of VR. There's two favorite parts. The first one is when you put the goggles on and you just sort of disappear into a new world. And the second one is when you take them off. All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be a slightly more formal gaming live stream than we usually do. I'm using the built-in mic to my Oculus, so my fear is that because the mic is right next to my nose, you guys are going to hear me breathing the whole time. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, for those that don't know, in case I end up posting this to my other channels, we've been doing a lot of gaming lately on Twitch and DLive. You can find links to those on disenthrall.me/platforms. And we usually do video games, but what ends up usually happening is that, through our gaming, we end up reaching a lot of people that we wouldn't otherwise reach. I totally forgot how to walk in this game. Here we go. Anyway, so this is going to be kind of informal. It's going to be kind of long. The point of this specific stream will be to have fun playing games in VR, which is awesome, but also we're going to be listening to a video that somebody sent me. The thing that we will be listening to, and maybe commenting on, is a video called The Basic Principles of Objectivism by Nathaniel Brandon. This is a video from the Atlas Society Audio Archives, lecture number 5 on free will. So if this ends up being good and sort of worthy of the rest of the normal viewers' attention, I will put a link to the original video in the description for you. And hopefully we can enjoy kind of watching some entertaining stuff as I kind of play through the game, and also listen to this objectivism's position on free will. Now, necessarily, let me actually start by a little introduction into why I'm interested in this. So the lecture itself is an hour and a half long. So if you're not here for an hour and a half long video, maybe watch this another time, or listen to it on another platform like SoundCloud as a podcast. But hey, I can like staple my fingers like I'm talking in real life. That's kind of cool. All right, so over the past 6 months to a year and a half, there's been a nagging question of free will. Does free will exist? Is kind of the whole entire question. And this has strong implications, especially for moral philosophy. So, obviously, a lot of people would say, well, if free will doesn't exist, then you can't hold somebody accountable for their actions, right? And so other people would say, of course, free will exists. ... So it's been a nagging question. More nagging recently than previously, because if you think about what free will is thought of to be this sort of decision-making machine that isn't sort of fettered by reality, is a good way of putting it. It's a machine that generates decisions for your brain. My goggles are fogging up really badly today for some reason. That's annoying. It's a decision-making machine that is not subject to the laws of nature, and that's a very important distinction. It's necessarily a magical machine, a magical decision-making machine. It's not bound by physics, and that's important. In fact, that's definitional, because if this decision-making machine is bound by physics, is bound by the laws of nature, then necessarily it becomes not free will. It becomes deterministic. Deterministic means sort of mathematical. You know, if you put in the same numbers into an equation, you will get the same output. If you put in the same input, you will get the same output. If it's a machine that is designed to do X and you push the start button, it will produce X. You know, of course, unless something goes wrong or breaks or whatever. So all things in nature behave deterministically. Now, there's some exceptions around quantum mechanics where things will seemingly be random, but randomness is not an exception, or not a it's not an out. It's not a free pass to free will, because free will is not random decision making, right? It's not, and it's also not deterministic decision making, meaning, you know, you were born into a certain situation and you were raised, you know, in a certain culture with certain beliefs and certain influences on your life. Uh-oh. Inventory's full. Hold on one second. Freighter. Oh man, look at all this. Yeah, so where was I? Okay, so free will is neither free will as it's normally thought of is neither deterministic nor random. You know, we don't make decisions with a random number generator. Otherwise, we would always just be kind of walking off into a random direction and just behaving completely erratically and nonsensically. So if our free will machine depended on random numbers, that would be its output. Randomness. And if our machine behaved objectively, if our machine behaved deterministically, then it's not really free will as we normally think of it. Meaning under our control in some way, like decisions unfettered by physics. So, like, definitionally, you can see, like, definitionally, free will, is defined. Free will is defined as the antithesis of being based on physics. Like, if it's based on physics, people would tell you that, well, that's not free will because it's, you know, governed by the laws of nature and physics. I am cleaning up my inventory by putting a bunch of stuff away. That's what's happening here. So, that leads one to really only have one option. If you think that, or if you hold the position that free will exists, you pretty much have a single option, and that is to believe that free will is sort of magical. That free will is supernatural in both its origins and its mechanics. That it does not behave according to the laws of nature. It does not function inside a machine. You know, like the operating system of free will is not. Wow, I got to figure out my buttons. The operating system of free will is not running on hardware that is bound by the laws of reality. Like, again, I'm stating the same thing in different ways because I'm trying to tease out what the definition of free will is. Because a lot of times when I ask people, well, define free will for me if we're going to have this discussion, people will say, well, my ability to sort of weigh my options and come to a decision. Well, you're describing the conscious, high-level impression of what free will is, but you're not describing the mechanical nature of free will. You're not describing the hardware that the software is running on. So, and that's the best way to describe it, because like consciousness, you know, is this sort of software running on top of this hardware called our brain, right? That's a pretty good way, I think. See, the walls of my base aren't rendering, so I'm getting lost in my own base. Okay, so like as I walk this direction, walls should disappear. See? That's so weird. Come on. Come on. Still walking the same way. God, This is not functional. Hello, games. I mean, 1 second to orient myself as to what I'm doing. Okay, we sent our fleet on an expedition while we were gone. One of them's red, so I'm assuming that it came back broken. Let's see. Everything's fine. Made some money. Picked up some pearls. Picked up some copper. Picked up some stuff, some money. I think that means one of them was broken. Picked up some goodies. Okay, whatever. Let's go check on our ships. Okay, so that's kind of the dilemma with free will, is that you have to believe in the supernatural to believe in free will. And obviously there's no evidence of the supernatural, so that becomes a problem. So, like if you believe in reality and don't believe in things that, have no evidence or can't be proven, then you have to come to the conclusion that consciousness runs on the hardware of the brain, of the neurons and all of the chemistry that happens in the brain. And so if consciousness is running on hardware, just like software running on my computer, the software running on my computer behaves deterministically. That means that the software running on my computer, given the same inputs, will produce the same output every single time, unless something breaks, obviously. Alright, so I need to find the ships, because one of them is broken. So I have 2 of these weird-looking sciencey ships. There's one. Trying to find the other one. Okay, there's the other one. We gotta find out which one's broken. And then this little arrowhead ship. Well, I bet it's this one. Let's see. Yep, it's that one. Woo! That's where you get motion sickness in this game. Alright, way too fast. Come on. There we go. Okay, so the topic of free will becomes pretty important for its potential implications on moral philosophy. Now, granted, a lot of moral philosophy doesn't depend on some of these discussions, because whether or not the fundamental physics of free will exist or not, people still behave as if they have free will. Which means that moral philosophy still has an effect on people's behavior. The same way, it can be obviously said and proven that religion, for example, has a very real effect on people's behavior. Now, whether or not that behavior arises from, the code of the software running on their hardware being modified by new input, or free will, in a physical, spiritual sense exists, doesn't matter for the purposes of trying to spread moral philosophy and like a moral understanding of behavior and judgments of behavior. So I don't want to get too far into that. Now, objectivists, who are right on a great many things except for their belief in the need for government, have a very strong... I need to reset my view. This is not working very well. So what we're doing right now is this is one of my ships that goes out on missions for me, and it got damaged in the last mission. So we have to fix it so we can send it out again. Okay, before I do this, we're going to reset my display. See if that works. Okay. How many more of these? Looks like we have one more damage point below us. Oh, there's 2 more. Okay. It's going to take a minute. Okay, so objectivism very much has a strong positive position on the existence of free will. And I have learned a lot from objectivism, and I have a strong respect for objectivism. And so when I'm having these difficult questions with understanding that free will exists, but is also running on hardware that exists in reality, I mean, that's obviously an uncomfortable, sort of conflicting position that I need to resolve. And so somebody has been following, one of the viewers of Disenthrall, followers of Disenthrall, has been trying to learn a lot from Objectivism, and so they sent me the link to this video. So long story short, however long we've been streaming already, just to give you this intro, I am occupying a position on free will that I'm uncomfortable with. Now, uncomfortable doesn't mean I think it's wrong. Obviously I only hold positions that I think are right. But I don't like this conclusion that I'm at right now. And so, as with any of my conclusions, whether I like them or not, I'm going to be open to having to new arguments and to new evidence. And so, to that end, I would like to thank the viewer that sent me this video. So this is going to be Nathaniel Brandon's lecture on the Atlas Society Audio Archives. This is lecture number 5, called Free Will, the Basic Principles of Objectivism. One of the basic principles of Objectivism is the existence of free will. So, for the next hour and a half or whatever, we're going to be listening to this. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you enjoy the gameplay. If people join me in chat, we can pause the video to discuss. Otherwise, we can just have a good time. If this turns out well, I will clip it and throw it on the main platforms for people. Let me know what you think in the comments, if it makes it to those, if you like more of these sort of long-form commentaries. And so, I haven't heard this video yet. That's an important distinction. Like, this is not me, this is not a rebuttal. This is me trying to learn and to expose myself to an opinion that I have a feeling I'm going to have a problem with and disagree with. But it's always important that we keep learning and we keep exposing ourselves to new arguments. So that's what we're going to be doing here today. We're going to do it together. If you like that, then please let me know in the comments. We'll do more. Let's get started.
This evening's discussion, as you know, will center on the objectivist theory of volition. It will be concerned with elaborating the principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness. This theory is central and basic both to objectivist philosophy and to objectivist psychology. What is meant by the statement that man is a being of volitional consciousness? Well, I will ask you first of all to consider the following.
Okay, I always listen the absolute closest. Like, I'll sit up and pay really close attention to the beginning of these lectures, because that's when they cover their definitions. And everything, the argument is in the definitions. So we gotta make sure we're clear on this. Just kind of pointing out my thoughts as we go.
In a previous lecture, I have discussed the fact that there are 3 basic cognitive units or forms of awareness that characterize man's consciousness: sensations, perceptions, conceptions. And I have discussed the fact that the process of integrating individual disparate sensations into percepts is done automatically by the nervous system and the brain. That is, sensations flow into the organism. These are automatically integrated and related, enabling man to be aware of reality perceptually. That is, to be aware of objects, of entities. I then discussed how man moves from the perceptual level of consciousness to the uniquely and distinctively human level, the conceptual level, by integrating his percepts into concepts, then integrating his concepts into still wider abstractions, and so forth. Now, the first level of abstractions or concepts the awareness of such phenomena, let's say, as green or hard or soft, these also take place automatically and universally in any normal brain. That is, these most primitive of concepts, which are the building blocks of all subsequent thinking, these too appear to be integrated automatically by the brain. By that I mean, there's no way that a normal person could escape forming such fundamental primitive concepts as green, brown, red, hard, soft, etc. The category, in a word, of attributes which can only be defined ostensibly. In other words, that level of concepts which constitute, as it were, generalizations of direct sensory experiences, which are one step away from percepts. For example, if one looks at 3 different green objects and forms the concept green, well, here we deal with a very easy, very elementary, and just about inescapable kind of concept that no normal brain could escape forming. Beyond this level, however, the brain no longer produces concepts automatically. That is, as soon as you rise above this most primitive level of concepts into the genuine sphere of the conceptual faculty, in a word, as soon as the infant is functioning on the level where thinking can said to have begun, we are no longer dealing with a cognitive process that functions automatically. Whether or not the infant, the young man, the adult, will think or not to think, this is an act of choice which he has to make. It is not a function which is forced upon him or determined or necessitated by his nature in the sense in which the integration of his sensations into percepts is automatic. Putting it another way, you have only to open your eyes and you cannot escape seeing objects and entities. That is automatic. But in order to think, you have to do something. You have to generate effort. You have to focus your minds. You have to choose to set the machinery in motion. You have to choose to seek to understand that which is not immediately given, that which is not self-evident, that which is not inescapably there in your immediate sensory experience, but rather that which you must reach by a process of conceptual reasoning. To quote from Galt's speech, quote, "Man is a being of volitional consciousness. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The function of your mind is not. In any hour and issue of your life, you are free to think or to evade that effort. But you are not free to escape from your nature, from the fact that reason is your means of survival."
So I think he's thinking at a level that's one up from the fundamental question, from the actual question. He's saying, let me try and state his argument to make sure I get it right. So he's saying, when you open your eyes, your brain automatically, like I look down and I see joystick and throttle control and red button that doesn't actually do anything, and that's a ship in front of me, and etc. And so he's saying that we don't have control over sort of that process of identifying objects or conceptualizing, which is really a kind of a mostly unique human trait, which is to conceptualize, which is to say, You know, we can look at two sort of humans, and we can realize that while they may share traits, they're not the exact same object, but they both, the shared traits can classify them into a concept called human. Animals, while they can sort of classify things in a really rudimentary way, can often not be able to also make distinctions about that classification. Anyway, I don't want to dive too deeply into this, but then he says, to then, like, once our brain has classified things for us, it's a choice whether to then think about our precepts, as he says. Like, I am sitting here, it's very interesting that we're having this free will video discussion while in virtual reality. So, you know, my brain is perceiving that ship and these controls in front of me, and then I can either choose to think about them or not choose to think about them. And so seems like that's the fundamental basis for what he's saying as a volitional creature, humans being volitional. They can choose not to think. He's saying you can't choose not to have your brain classify objects. He says that sort of happens automatically, but he says you can choose not to then think about those precepts, and therefore, you know, I guess that's the beginning of volition. He hasn't really said free will yet, but maybe we'll get there. I would just point out that he's one step above the actual question of free will at this point. Maybe he'll get to it, maybe not. But the step below what he's saying is, what is the mechanism by which the choice is made to think or not to think? Is the machine that is making that choice running on hardware bound by the laws of nature? Or is it spiritual, supernatural, magical, bound to another universe's rules, whatever? It's either running on a platform called the brain that exists in this universe, which has components made up of matter in this universe, bound by the laws of this universe, in which case it is a machine that, you know, is granted made up of a bunch of really tiny parts, sure, but it is still a machine bound by the laws of reality, which are, you know, by and large, I keep losing that word, deterministic, or, you know, maybe with a little randomness built in for the quantum stuff, neither of which is sort of volitional, neither of which is free will. It's not a choice. It's like if these signals and wiring in your brain, you know, and the electrical signals running through them result in a desire to think, then you would think. And if the electrical system's signals result in a desire to not think about the precepts, then you would not think about the precepts. So far, I'm not on board. I'm not seeing it. Let's continue, though. We've got a long way to go. Hopefully he'll tie it together.
So that for you, who are a human being, the question to be or not to be is the question to think or not to think. Close quote. In this choice to think or not to think, to focus one's mind or not to focus it, to assume the responsibility of the conceptual level of consciousness or to evade it, and in this choice alone is man psychologically free. That choice, once made, does not continue to direct man's mind unceasingly thereafter, with no further effort required. Just as the state of full mental focus must be initiated volitionally, so it must be maintained volitionally. The choice to think must be reaffirmed in the face of every new issue and problem. The decision to be in focus yesterday will not compel man to be in focus today. The decision to be in focus about one question will not compel man to be in focus about another. The decision to pursue a certain...
So far this seems like, and I don't want to make conclusions yet because we're 6 minutes into an hour and a half presentation, this seems like begging the question. You know, he's saying you're making decisions to focus one's mind. Well, we're talking about free will, and we're talking about volition. So if you're building into your definition of volition, making a choice, then you've kind of begged the question. That's a logical fallacy where you include the conclusion in the premise of the logical proof. But hopefully, you know, that's not where we're at.
Certain value does not guarantee that man will exert the mental effort needed to achieve it. In any hour of his life, then, man is free to suspend the function of his consciousness, to abandon effort, and to let his mind drift in will-less passivity. Or he is free to maintain only a partial focus, grasping that which comes easily to his understanding and declining to struggle for that which does not.
He's saying you're free to choose to focus your mind. Well, what again? I don't want to. I feel like I'm going to repeat myself a lot, so I'm going to try and not do that. I've kind of already made the case against what he just said. There's an argument below the one where he's making, which is like, what is the mechanism by which that choice is determined? That is the subject of this discussion. The choice to focus your mind, to stop focusing your mind, to continue moment to moment focusing your mind. These are desires. This is a will. These are, you know, what is the mechanism that makes you choose this stuff? And he said something at the end there. Let me try and rewind just a little bit. I'm using my VR controllers, so this is going to suck.
It is a state and an operation which each one of you is able less passivity. Or he is free to maintain only a partial focus, grasping that which comes easily to his understanding.
That's what it was. He says you're free to maintain. You are free to decide whether or not to focus your mind. Like, to some, if the definition of free will for this talk is going to be the ability to make decisions absent outside coercion, I think that's a different question of free will. So we might be in maybe another word. Maybe this is addressing a different kind of free will than the problem that I'm having. Like, I'm looking for the mechanism of free will. Maybe he's going to discuss your ability to make decisions without having a gun pointed at you to force you, you know, to apply pressure on you to choose a specific decision. Hopefully that's not where he's going. But when he says you are free to decide to focus your mind, it sounds like he's saying, well, there's no outside compulsion, there's no outside force or threat being used on you to cause you to decide to focus your mind or not. Let's continue.
And declining to struggle for that which does not. Now consider this concept of focusing the mind. It is a state and an operation which each one of you is able very easily to discern introspectively. You all know what it means to be in a state of kind of vague, floating, or dreaming, thinking about nothing, and then suddenly to attend to some particular issue, mentally to attend, to focus, to aim your cognitive faculty, as it were, in a certain direction. To say to yourself now, grasp this, make this intelligible, understand this. A simple example is one that you encounter every morning when you're waking up. You wake up and you're a bit drowsy and you feel as though your consciousness is rather splintered perhaps for a few seconds or minutes or hours.
Okay, so another example, I'm just trying to make sure I'm following along. Another example of this would be my decision to engage with this content. This is me sort of waking my mind up, hitting the go live button to talk to you guys while we stream this. I certainly could have maybe mindlessly played this video game, or I could have gone downstairs and turned on the TV and gone into a vegetable coma. But I chose... see, this is going to be a problem. We're going to get attacked. Okay, hold on. Put philosophy on hold. $300,000 bounty. I've never done that before. This might be hard. Alright, we're going to do this and then we'll get back. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Oh, Oh, I think this weapon is not going to work. We're going to need a different weapon. There we go. So I could have sat back and been a vegetable. I could have been, you know, like had a restful evening where I didn't do any mental work. I didn't choose to focus my mind. Again, I'm going to try and not repeat myself over and over. My question on free will is what caused me? What was the mechanism by which I selected the outcome of spending time engaging my mind to this end, to this question? That's the question of free will, not sort of the higher level, the one-up level discussion of choosing to focus my mind or not choosing. Did we get it? Got a gold nugget. We got, what else we got? That's it? Oh, there's another one. I want my money. Here we go. I'll hit play as soon as this fight's over. It's going to be impossible for me to be in combat. And actually focus my mind on what this guy's saying. So let me get this guy out of the way here, and then we'll continue. I actually want to basically make today like an exploration game day, so we're just going to go look through a whole bunch of star systems. I want to try and find like a paradise planet to make a base on someday. We'll see how that goes. So kind of, I need to be able to do a game activity that doesn't require my mind being focused. God, I'm terrible at VR combat, VR space combat. Ship is not exactly responsive here. Here we go. Alright. Come. Oh, God, I'm all over the place. Where are you? Where are you? There you are. Did we get it? Oh, come on. One shot. One shot. Come on. Ah, kill it. Okay, we got it. 300,000. All right, cool. Let me hit play again, and we will continue.
And at some point, presumably, you say, in effect, well, now, what do I have to do today? And you begin to think over what is ahead of you this day and what you have to attend to. That's an act that you can catch, a very easy kind of act of focusing your mind, of making yourself fully conscious. There are many other examples which I shall discuss reflecting the same basic choice, to think or not to think, to focus or not to focus. But in order to appreciate in a biological context this distinct human faculty, before proceeding with a further description of what the volitional faculty is and how it functions, I want to give it the following brief biological context. A basic characteristic of the actions of living organisms, of all living organisms, as distinguished from inanimate matter, is that the actions of living entities are goal-directed. That is, they are self-regulated action moving towards a certain end or goal. Now, obviously, when we deal with unconscious, or more precisely non-conscious organisms like plants, we don't speak of the goal as something which the plant holds since it has no mind, but that we, looking at the outside, can see that there is a logic governing all of the actions of the plant or the tree or the shrub. One can see a unifying principle at work, and we see that the principle of life is always an integrated series of complex actions taken in that direction which will promote the growth and the survival of the organism. For example, you all have seen the perhaps instance of a plant beginning to grow in the direction of the sunlight, and then perhaps a boulder rolls over part of it, and it begins to grow around the boulder, as though there is a clear principle directing it, and it has a certain highly limited ability to vary its motion or its direction to end up in the same place, that is, in a place where it will be at reach of the sun. Or we know of many experiments where scientists interfere with the normal processes of the growth of a tree, and within certain limits we see that the living organism has a certain flexibility to vary certain of its actions in order to end up with the same result. This is well known in biology, of course. You can observe it internally on the vegetative level of your own bodies. That is, a very complex series of actions go on constantly within your own bodies, all organized in an immensely complex way to add up to one result, namely the preservation of the life of the organism. The action is not random. It's highly structured, it's highly organized, and what you observe is that the life principle, whatever we may yet have to discover about it, the life principle possesses as its key characteristic this aspect of goal-directed, self-regulating action. All living organisms, however simple or however complex, exhibit it universally. That's entailed in the very nature of what it means to be alive. Now, observe the transition from a plant to an animal. What you observe is an increasing complexity in the type of self-regulation which becomes possible. On the vegetative level or the plant level, you get an internal chemical, internal structural kind of regulatory activity. But you see a more complex expression of the principle of self-regulated action as soon as you enter the realm of conscious animals. Why? Because we observe that consciousness is the regulator of the action of the organism viewed as a total entity. What would be a simple example of this? Well, something very easy. Your cat or dog is walking across the room, and there's a cart.
I really need a way to rewind this thing with a little bit more fine-grainedness. Let's see if I can help. I want to make sure I understand his definition of consciousness. I think it's important for this discussion.
Because we observe that consciousness is the regulator of the action of the organism viewed as a total entity. What would be a simple example of this? Well, something very easy. Your cat or dog is walking across the room, and there's a carton in the middle of the living room. It sees it, and it walks around it. That's the simplest example of where consciousness is regulating and guiding the action which the animal is taking. The animal, of course, depends for its survival upon its sense of smell, and of course its sense of smell is one aspect of its consciousness. So we see animals guided by their sensation.
All right, I'm going to pause that because these things are usually big plot points, so I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Spoiler alert, if you haven't played No Man's Sky, this might be spoilers. I am close to the end. The truth of the universe is fire. The soul is light. This is a very existential game to be playing while thinking about free will, because the entire point of this game is about free will versus being a simulation. That's interesting. Interesting coincidence that we play No Man's Sky while considering free will. Anyway, the truth of the universe is fire. The soul is light. I am the experiment and the observer, all creation constructed for my journey. I see the universe around me and I know that it is good. I see the universe around me and I know that I shall create my own. Not long now, not far to go, the stars beckon with cold fire and I rush to meet them soon, very soon. And I learned a new formula. This one-of-a-kind Atlas seed holds an aesthetically pleasing mathematical construct salvaged from the simulation of an alternate reality. Novae reclaimant. This is modified quanta. At this point. I don't know. Alright. Anyway, back to what we were doing.
Which obviously carries implicitly in it our recognition that an animal is guided by its form of consciousness. Now, an animal's consciousness is passive in that it can react to external stimuli, and according to how it reacts, being the passive recipient of messages coming in from the outside, it will, within limits, regulate the action which the animal will take accordingly. Animals are distinguished from plants, of course, by virtue of the fact that they can move, that they're not anchored to one spot, and their consciousness guides them in this process of motion. And so here, when you enter the animal realm, you observe a higher, more complex type of life organization and a more complex kind of self-regulated action. Now, when you deal with man, you deal not only with consciousness, but with a particular form or kind of consciousness to which we give the name mind. Man possesses a mind, a reasoning faculty, a capacity to think, to abstract, to conceptualize. And now you observe, with a corresponding increased complexity of life organization, a new kind, a new advance, a still more complex form of self-regulatory action, namely, a being who is able to regulate the action of his own consciousness. That is what it means to say that man is a being of volitional consciousness.
Okay, hold on.
Man can direct
That was important.
his
We're gonna listen to that again.
What do I mean when I say that? Well, most of you, or many of you, now when you deal with man, it will, within limits, regulate the action which the animal will take accordingly. Animals are distinguished from plants, of course, by virtue of the fact that they can move, that they're not anchored to one spot, and their consciousness guides them in this process of motion. And so here, when you enter the animal realm, you observe a higher, more complex type of life organization and a more complex kind of self-regulated action. Now, when you deal with man, you deal not only with consciousness, but with a particular form or kind of consciousness to which we give the name mind. Man possesses a mind, a reasoning faculty, a capacity to think, to abstract, to conceptualize. And now you observe, with a corresponding increased complexity of life organization, a new kind, a new advance, a still more complex form of self-regulatory action, namely, a being who is able to regulate the action of his own consciousness.
The ability to regulate the action of his own consciousness. Hey, NCAP, welcome. This is kind of a more formal episode where we are listening to a lecture and kind of talking through free will, an important concept that I'm trying to learn more about to make sure my positions are accurate. So, welcome to the stream. I hope you enjoy.
That is what it means to say that man is a being of volitional consciousness. Man can direct his consciousness. What do I mean when I say that? Well, most of you, or many of you, probably own pets, and that will help you to give a concrete sense of what I'm talking about. A pet hears a sound and it jerks its head in that direction. Animals are entirely dependent upon and tied to the cues in their sensory fields. They don't think up problems to solve. They don't say, what will I think about today? And they certainly don't say, I'd rather not think about that today. It's too upsetting. Their consciousnesses are passive reactors to the stimuli which they receive.
No. He's still one layer above.
One of the distinctive attributes of man's consciousness is that man has the power to regulate his own consciousness, to regulate its action, to in effect decide in what direction it will go.
That's that begging the question thing that I mentioned earlier. Again, I don't want to spend this entire hour and 20 minutes repeating myself, but I think that might be the core conflict here. The the unanswered issue with this conception of free will is that it's sort of begging the question. It's like when you decide to focus your attention, when you decide to control how your consciousness behaves from moment to moment, and when you decide to change how your consciousness is behaving, what is the mechanism of that decision? It's sort of like chicken and the egg with this. Like whatever mechanism that makes the choices is where the will is. And anyway, I'm repeating myself again. Here we go. Let's continue.
Putting it differently, to decide whether or not it will think, whether or not it will turn the conceptual level or focus on at all. The basic act of self-regulation possible to a human consciousness is to direct that consciousness.
It's Yank. How you doing, bud?
Oh, hey, you're in chat. Hey, man, what's up?
Not much.
You're welcome to hang out. I'm just kind of doing a commentary on this video here. So,
Well, I'm doing my thing, so I'm not self-advertising. I'm doing my thing, so I figured I would hang out in the voice chat with you.
No, dude, you're totally welcome. And if we hit a spot in this video that you have commentary on, speak up. We can talk about it. Just to fill you in, this is a lecture from the Atlas Society Audio Archives on free will from the Objectivism standpoint. So Objectivism very much depends on free will being a thing, and that's challenging a lot of my current positions that I'm uncomfortable with. So I'm sort of hoping for somebody to prove me wrong, and that's kind of what we're doing here. So far,
Nice.
we're 18 minutes in, and it's been not very convincing to me. So we'll see how it goes.
Right on.
Aimed in the direction of being aware, of being optimally.
You're not going to be able to hear the video on the Discord voice, though. So if you want to hear the video, I guess you'll probably have to listen to the stream.
And I got your stream pulled up because I'm also doing my stream.
Yeah, cool.
Conscious of seeking to understand that with which it is dealing, or to suspend conscious focus, to go out of focus, to induce an inner fog. That is the basic self-regulatory option which a man has over his own consciousness. Putting it differently, what man controls is the primary goal. What he directly and volitionally controls is the primary goal or end which his consciousness is to pursue. And there's only one basic choice. Either, in any given issue, a consciousness seeks to know, to grasp something,
for the quest, I was following my
fails to,
the final,
or evades the effort, or evades the responsibility of seeking to grasp. And this is another way of saying that man's basic choice is to think or not to think. Now let me concretize further what specifically this choice is and means. There are three fundamental expressions of the choice to think or not to think. Three different cardinal forms in which that issue presents itself to man. The first and the most general I have already indicated, namely, to focus, to seek to understand, or to remain in an internal state of fog, or to induce the state of inner fog. That is the basic fundamental choice, to focus or not to focus, to seek always to understand, to seek always to widen the range of one's awareness, to seek mentally to grow, to expand the reach of one's consciousness, or not to bother, or to say it's too much work, or it's too painful, or I don't want to know, it will be inconvenient, or whatever the case may be. Another form in which this choice, this same choice, presents itself to man occurs any time he experiences a conflict or a clash between his mind and his emotions, or his reason and his feelings. That is, any time he finds that he should do something because it makes sense, but he doesn't want to, or he wants to do something, or desires something, or fears something, even though he knows it is wrong or irrational to do so. Then the question is, does he remain in mental focus? Does he preserve his conscious knowledge and consequently be guided by that?
I'm going to pause the video for a second. Guys, did we find the paradise planet we were looking for, like on the second system we jumped to? I figured it was going to take like 4 hours of like gameplay to like go through 100 systems to find it. This is gorgeous.
Oh, yeah.
There's like,
you got a beautiful planet on your stream there, yeah.
Blue water, palm trees, gorgeous sky, no sentinel activity on the radar. I need to land and check it out though. Let's see. Let's see if I can land here.
How's the scan from space? Are there any droids to worry about?
It didn't say any sentinel activity, and it didn't say any bad weather. I'm trying to like look. Oh, that's like a VR flaw. The stats of the system I just got out of the ship on is out of my view to the bottom left. That's great. All right.
Yeah.
Let's look at this. Discoveries. What planet are we on? We're on Ford. Even has a semi-normal name. Weather boiling puddles. Low sentinels. I've never seen a low sentinel planet yet. Full flora and moderate fauna. Star bulb, silver, paraffinium, and copper. 14 fauna. That's a lot. Guys, this might be it. This might be our forever home. I'm kind of surprised that we found it. Second try today. Alright, so we're basically going to spend probably the next hour like touring this planet and scanning stuff.
Nice.
Alright, let me continue the video here. Hold on.
Or does he suspend his conscious knowledge? Does he render his conscious knowledge inoperative in order to drift under the passive sway of his feeling, emotion, or desire? And that, again, is the choice to think or not to think. If a man wants to do something which is irrational, he has to turn off.
Again, I'm just I'm not really commenting again on the spot because I would just say the same thing I just said. Like, he's talking about your decision to decide means you have volition. Well, I'm saying, well, what is the mechanism by which you make the decision to decide? That's going to be the recursion problem that you run into.
Off his mind, turn off his critical faculty, suspend his consciousness, and shrink his awareness down to the fact that he wants it, period. And make himself blind to and unconscious of anything else.
Welcome back,
which means he has to go out of focus. He has to cease to think. The third basic form in which the choice to think or not to think presents itself to man is the issue between his consciousness and the consciousness of others, the issue between intellectual sovereignty.
October 15. Thank you for the follow. Much appreciate you. Welcome. It's Thursday, almost Friday.
Will he seek with his own mind to understand that which is true, and when he has formed judgments, remain loyal to the best of his own honest understanding until and unless he has reason to revise his judgments? Or will he abdicate the responsibility of independent thinking, of independent judgment, and accept passively and uncritically the views and the judgments of other people instead? These, then, are the three fundamental forms in which man comes up against the question to think or not to think. This is the nature of the self-regulatory action which man performs with regard to his own consciousness.
As I was bouncing through the
control
various systems on the other quests as well,
which one has over one's own consciousness. You see, in a certain sense, one's consciousness or mind is always doing something, even if only little random thoughts or feelings are flicking through it. Something is happening. At all times. Life is always action in some sense. Now, the option or the choice then consists of determining or controlling or directing the goal which the action is to take.
It feels like he's saying the same thing over and over in different
Suppose you
ways.
come into this classroom tonight, and you're sitting and your mind is just floating and popping around from subject to subject, and let's say that it's not thinking about anything in particular. And then you look up and you see that the lecture's about to begin. And you tell yourself, in effect, well, now it's time to concentrate and pay attention if I'm to understand this lecture. Well, now, in that moment, a choice has to be made. You have to, in effect, decide, now I am going to set my intellectual machinery in a certain direction, aimed at a certain goal, namely the goal being
What's wrong, Pyro?
to understand what Mr. Brandon has to say and to judge it. Now, for most of you, that process occurs so naturally that you're not even aware of it when it happens.
Why?
And yet there
Why
was
would
a
I-
moment for each one of you
Okay.
when you had to, in effect, aim your consciousness in the direction of the words I'm now saying.
Why? I'm not sad
And
about
implicitly
anything.
give yourself the order, grasp what he is saying. Now let's take an imaginary example which will illustrate the three variants of the choice to think or not to think. Suppose I begin to speak, and you at a certain point find that in order to understand, you have to maintain a very clear mental focus, and you cannot doze off and just float for a minute, because if you do, you're going to lose the train of thought. And suppose you then say, well, it's just too hard, it's too much trouble, it's too much bother, thinking is such a chore, and you let yourself go out of focus. Well, that's one variant of the choice to think or not to think. Let's pick another example. Suppose that you are focused and you are thinking along with me, but at a certain point, a certain connection falls into place in your mind. Suppose you're intelligent and you're thinking ahead of me, and at a certain point you realize, well, if I get the direction of where Brandon is going, or what one of the implications of what he's saying would be, if indeed the choice to think or not to think is volitional, then that means that on those times when I acted irresponsibly, like a drunken driver without knowing what I was doing, it was my fault. A volitional irresponsibility is involved. Oh God, that's an unpleasant thought. I don't like the implications of that line of thinking he's developing. I better get out of here. Well, you don't physically leave, you just put your mind out of focus. That is an example of the principle of reason versus feelings. What is it that matters most? To grasp whether it's true or false, or to be driven by how you happen to feel about what might be the results of it being true or false, respectively? Suppose that you pass both hurdles. You remain in focus, you're not afraid of using your mind, and you're not afraid of the consequences. But at a certain point, you remember that in college you were told by your sociology teacher that everybody agrees today that man is responsible for nothing and can help nothing. But Brandon up there, it suddenly occurs to you, is saying that isn't true. It's not true that man is a helpless pawn of fate or circumstances.
That's actually pretty sick.
But everybody says he is.
Wow. That
Why
is
the devil
really
should I have to
sad.
decide? I better get out of here. And so you go out of focus and cease to hear me. That would be three examples, all dramatizations of the choice to think or not to think. Now, it is very important in understanding the principle of volition and how it works to distinguish this basic choice to focus one's mind and to think from the question of what sort of things one will choose to think about. Because obviously the sort of things one will choose to think about in any day or week or month will depend upon a wide variety of factors: one's interests, one's values, one's context, one's problems, etc.,
exactly
and
right,
so
yeah.
forth. They are not chosen as primary acts of free choice, meaning that if on any given day you wake up and you decide to be in full focus, that is what volition directly pertains to, the decision to be in full focus. But assuming you are in full focus, you don't decide in that primary same way, in a vacuum, so to speak, what you will think about, because obviously in any given day you have a context, you have continuous problems, you have a life, you have interests, you have values, etc., and so forth, and they will obviously be relevant to what you will choose to think about. Let's give an example. I wake up early this morning and I focus, and I habitually ask myself, well, what's the program or the agenda for today? What am I going to be concerned with today? And within a second, what comes into my mind is that I am writing an article for the Objectivist newsletter, and that I must finish it by a certain date. And I remember that there are certain tricky problems, and when I stopped working yesterday, I was stuck on something. And there are problems I have to solve today and get on with the job. And as I'm getting up and shaving and brushing my teeth, my mind is going to the article when I'll be at my desk in a few minutes and remembering where I left off yesterday, and perhaps I'm imagining different ways I could try to express such and such a thought. Well, once I am in focus, it's very natural that I find my mind going particularly, specifically to the subject of that article, since that right now is my immediate concern. I don't say to myself in a vacuum, well, today now then, what shall I think about? My article, or deep sea diving, or polo perhaps, or crab fishing? Well, that would be absurd, wouldn't it? All of those other choices are not primary choices. They're not direct, free choices. They obviously depend upon a great many antecedent factors, to repeat, your values, your problems, your context, etc., and so forth. Now, there is a question which I am often asked about this choice to think or not to think, and which I would like to discuss with you. Students will often ask me some variant of this question. Doesn't a man have to be thinking already in order to choose to think?
Aha!
If you're not thinking already, how do you choose to think? And there's a certain confusion in that question, which I want to clarify, and in clarifying it, I think will throw more light on this whole concept of volition. As I have said, the primary choice to think, that is, to focus one's mind, to set it to the purpose of active cognitive integration, must be distinguished from any other category of choice. It must be distinguished from the decision to think about a particular subject, which depends on one's values, interests, knowledge, and context. And again, it must be distinguished from the decision to perform a particular physical action, which again depends on one's values, interests, knowledge, and context. These decisions obviously involve complex causal antecedents, of a kind which the choice to focus does not. A man's choice to focus is a primary. It's a psychological primary, a first cause within man's consciousness. The principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness has reference specifically, of course, as I have indicated, to the human form of consciousness, that is, to the conceptual level of awareness. The perceptual level which man shares with animals is automatic. To be aware of the physical concretes of his immediate sensory field, man merely has to be awake, assuming, of course, a normal brain state.
Like I said, my
but to engage in an active process of cognitive integration, to abstract, conceptualize, relate, infer, to reason, man must focus his mind. He must set it to the
Nice,
task
Byron,
of active
nice.
integrating.
That's
This
how you do it.
level of awareness must be achieved and maintained volitionally. Now here is a very important thought. The act of focusing pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning, not to its content. I want to repeat that
There's a savageness, Ratchet.
Oh man.
What's that?
So we just got a. It looks like a heat storm. So this planet has heat storms. Why
But
did
how
it not
frequent
say
are
that?
they?
It just says weather, boiling puddles. Like, how is a raining heat storm a puddle? I don't understand that.
Well, how do those heat puddles get there?
It's
Well,
just raining. There's no puddles. It's just raining, and it's 216 degrees.
Get yourself some heat shields.
Yeah, no, I mean, the heat's not a problem specifically. Like, just when looking for, like, the perfect paradise planet, I wanted good weather. I like, in order of, like, what I wanted water that wasn't red, because so many planets have had, like, orange and red water. And this one has blue water. And I wanted, like, low sentinel activity and good weather.
That's what mine has. Mine's got my home planet has all that, and it has a very occasional heat storm. That's about it.
Okay, well, I don't really know how this is my first heat storm, so we'll see how it goes.
All right.
I'll stick around. We'll keep exploring a little bit. We won't give up right away.
The act of focusing pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning.
How does our stream look?
Not
Like
to
I
its
said,
content.
I did bump up the bit rate to 4,500.
To understand the process of
3,000.
Okay, 30 minutes in. We're doing good.
The act of focusing
Nice.
pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning.
Well,
Not
Ratchet,
to
it wasn't the
its
warp.
content.
It was
I want to repeat that statement.
This one. It was the
act of
impulse drive.
Focusing pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning, not to its content. To understand the process of
for sure.
focusing, I must
I agree
discuss briefly with you
I'm
the
looking at
concept of
my own
levels of
stream, and
awareness.
I think I need to hop out of voice chat so that you can talk to your stream companions, and I can finish this video, and then I can hop back in afterwards.
my apologies.
No, you don't have to apologize. You're streaming, dude. I just I need to get through this. I got an hour left.
Oh, alrighty.
I will catch up. I'll be back.
All right, sounds good.
All right, let me just rewind it just a little bit. 33 minutes. There we go.
Volitionally.
Here we go. Come on, wow me with some points here, guy.
Thought.
Very important thought.
The act of focusing pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning, not to its content. I want to repeat that statement. The act of focusing pertains to the operation of the faculty of consciousness, to its method of functioning, not to its content. To understand the process of focusing, I must discuss briefly with you the concept of levels of awareness. A consciousness can function on different levels of awareness. This concept refers to the degree of active cognitive integration in which a mind is engaged. How actively is the mind seeking to grasp everything within its range, to assimilate it, to identify it? What sort of factors will reflect varying levels of consciousness or degrees of clarity or awareness? First of all, 1, the clarity or the vagueness of the mind's contents. The higher the level of awareness, the clearer the mental contents. The lower the level of awareness, the vaguer, the more dim unclear, the mental contents. 2, the degree to which the mind's activity involves abstractions or principles versus the degree to which it's concrete bound and is tied only to immediately present concretes. It's a higher level of awareness to think in terms of abstractions and principles than to see only that which is staring you directly in front of your nose. And 3, the level of awareness is reflected in the degree to which the relevant wider context is present or absent in the process of thinking. That is, when you are thinking about a given problem, do you hold the full context in which this problem exists? Do you seek to recall and to apply everything relevant that could possibly help you to know how to deal with this? Or do you look at the problem as though you were born 1 minute before and knew nothing? And you forget all of your past knowledge and all of your past experience and try to deal with the problem as though your brain literally had begun to work only 1 minute ago. That, again, will determine the level of awareness, the level of mental advancement on which one functions. Thus, you see, there are degrees of awareness, degrees of consciousness. The alternative is not simply absolute unconsciousness or optimal consciousness. The choice to focus or to think does not consist of moving from a state of literal unconsciousness to a state of consciousness. This clearly would be impossible. When one is asleep, one cannot suddenly choose to start thinking. To focus is to move from a lower level of consciousness to a higher level. To move from mental passivity to purposeful mental activity. To initiate a process of directed cognitive integration. In a state of passive or relatively passive awareness, a man can apprehend the need to be in full mental focus. His choice is then to evade that knowledge or to exert the effort of raising the level of his awareness. Just as focusing involves expanding the range of one's awareness, so evasion consists of the reverse process, of shrinking the range of one's awareness. Evasion, meaning the blind refusal to think, the rejection of that which you know or could know, evasion takes the form of refusing to raise the level of one's awareness when one knows, clearly or dimly, that one should, or of lowering the level of one's awareness when one knows that one shouldn't. I want to repeat that very important statement. Evasion takes the form of refusing to raise the level of one's awareness when one knows, clearly or dimly, that one should, or of lowering the level of one's awareness when one knows that one shouldn't. When a man acts and functions with his mind unfocused, we may, in certain contexts, refer to him as unconscious. This is a means of indicating that such a man is existing on a level of awareness inadequate to the requirements of human survival. That is, he is attempting to exist in a state inadequate to the cognition of reality which human survival requires. He is attempting, in effect, to exist on the passive perceptual level that is appropriate to a lower animal. But this is a specialized use of the term unconscious. For example, if you see a person acting without thinking, you might say to him, for heaven's sake, be conscious. Well, you don't mean literally that he's unconscious. What you mean is he's not conscious enough. He's existing on a very vague, diffuse, low level of consciousness, utterly inadequate to the task in which he is engaged. Speaking literally, of course, when a man is awake and his brain and nervous system are structurally normal, he is conscious, if only passively. This basic level of consciousness is given to him by nature, as it were. Volition pertains to the responsibility of raising this basic level to the active conceptual level which is appropriate to man.
Is he saying that this active level is not given to him by nature?
This, then, in very general outline, is what the principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness means. Man is a being who must direct his consciousness to an appropriate level, that is, appropriate to the tasks required of reality. That does not happen automatically. Man must control that mental process.
Yeah, by what mechanism? That whatever mechanism that is free will. We're going to keep going back there.
Now,
Maybe.
when we say that man normally has
come
the
on, man.
power to think or not to think, to exercise this basic choice, this basic type of self-regulatory action, I must emphasize that one always speaks in the context of a normal brain. One always speaks in the context of a normal being. Now, one very small point of clarification that might otherwise, if I omitted this, be a question for some of you. You might ask 2 points, but isn't it sometimes harder to think than other times, as for example when you're tired? Yes, indeed it is. And here we deal with a partly physical factor. Obviously, if you've been up all night, it's harder to concentrate at 7 o'clock in the morning if you haven't been to sleep yet than if you had been to sleep for 10 preceding hours. But this is obviously a physical factor, and one assumes normal conditions. What you do have the power to know, if you have been up for 24 hours, is that you are awfully tired, that you are finding it excruciatingly difficult to think clearly, and therefore that this is not the time to make any crucial decisions. That is the form in which you still remain adequately conscious. You remain conscious enough to know what your own state is and that you had best go to bed. Or again, suppose it happens that a person is immensely upset over something very painful or distressing or agitating which has happened. Well, here again, his responsibility consists of knowing that he is in that state. I am not saying that he necessarily has to or will always be able to think as clearly. Some people can to a remarkable extent, however, but I am not saying that he must always or be expected to think as clearly when he is upset as when he is not upset. But he has to be aware of the fact that he is upset. And if he feels himself that agitated and distraught, then in fact he has to say to himself and or to anybody with whom he is dealing, give me a chance to quiet down a little bit and pull myself together, and then I will begin to think about this subject or answer you or do whatever is appropriate. He still has to remain aware and can remain aware volitionally of what his own internal state is. And in that sense, that is a form of choosing to think, of recognizing in this case what your own state is, and again, of not speaking when one should remain silent and possibly say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. Now then, ladies and gentlemen, to continue our discussion of volition. You will appreciate, of course, that the principle that man is a being of volitional consciousness is a form of free will theory. This, in effect, is a very brief summary of what objectivism means by the concept of free will. And those of you who are familiar with the many different historical interpretations which have been given to the concept of free will appreciate how radically this differs from traditional understandings of what free will means. In the January 1964 issue of the Objectivist newsletter, I did an article specifically distinguishing the objectivist theory of free will from traditional historical theories. Man's basic choice to repeat lies in his basic self-regulatory power over the function of his consciousness, the choice to focus, to think, or not to think. man does not have the power as a primary first cause to choose his emotions or desires or to change them at will. His emotions and desires are, of course, the product of his values, and these can be altered only indirectly by rethinking his values and premises and, as a consequence, altering his desires or emotions. Now, this type of psychological freedom does not mean that man is omniscient. It does not mean that man is infallible. It does not mean that man can never make mistakes. It does not mean that man is impervious to any and all external circumstances, which is obviously absurd. There are many factors which can affect our lives, such as wars, economic collapses, which can crucially affect our lives, over which we as individuals may have no power whatsoever. Therefore, I talk specifically about a sphere of psychological freedom, which of course is crucial, because given the external circumstances and given the knowledge available to man, it is specifically the degree of his thinking which is going to determine his character and the course which his life will take. Now, this view of man's nature stands in sharp opposition to the view that dominates our culture in general and the social sciences in particular, namely the doctrine of psychological determinism. Psychological determinism denies the existence of any element of freedom or volition in man's consciousness. It holds that every action, desire, and thought of man is determined by forces beyond his control. It holds that, in relation to his actions, decisions, values, and conclusions, man is ultimately and essentially passive. That man is merely a reactor to internal and external pressures. That those pressures determine the course of man's actions and the content of his convictions, just as physical forces determine the course of every particle of dust in the universe. It holds that, in any given situation or moment, only one choice, in quotes, is psychologically possible to man, the inevitable result of all the antecedent determining forces impinging upon him, just as only one action is possible to the speck of dust. Determinism holds that man has no actual power of choice, no actual freedom or self-responsibility. Man, according to this view, has no more actual volition than a stone. He is merely confronted with more complex alternatives and is manipulated by more complex forces.
And I hate that conclusion, but
The determinist concept
give me something
of
better.
mind entails a crucial contradiction, specifically an epistemological contradiction. It is, or rather can be shown to be, upon analysis, a self-refuting or self-invalidating theory. And I want now to direct your attention to the nature of this central and insuperable contradiction in the determinist position. A contradiction implicit in any variety of determinism, whether the alleged determining forces be physical, psychological, environmental, or divine. It wouldn't matter whether you hold that man is controlled and determined by the gods, or his genes, or his toilet training, or a socioeconomic environment, or background, or position. This contradiction is common to all of them. Consider the following. The determinist concept of mind maintains that whether a man thinks or not, whether he takes cognizance of the facts of reality or not, whether he holds facts above his feelings or his feelings above facts, all are determined by forces outside his control. In any given moment or situation, his method of mental functioning is the inevitable product of an endless chain of antecedent forces. He has no choice in the matter. That which a man does, declare the advocates of determinism, he had to do. That which he believes, he had to believe. If he focuses his mind, he had to. If he evades the effort of focusing, he had to. If he is guided solely by reason, he had to be. If he is ruled instead by feeling or whim, he had to be. He couldn't help it. No one can help anything. Such is the determinist thesis. But if this were true, no knowledge would be possible to man, as I shall show. No theory could claim greater plausibility than any other, including the theory of psychological determinism. Why? It is most essential to understand this issue. First of all, remember that man is neither omniscient nor infallible. This means, A, that he must work to achieve his knowledge, and B, that the mere presence of an idea inside his mind does not prove that the idea is true. Many ideas may enter a man's mind which are false. But if a man believes what he has to believe, if he is not free to test his beliefs against reality and to validate or reject them, if the actions and content of his mind are determined by factors that may or may not have anything to do with reason, logic, and reality, then he can never know if his conclusions are true or false. Knowledge is the correct identification of the facts of reality. And in order that he must work
we're gonna rewind that.
knowledge, and B,
let's listen to it again.
The mere presence of an idea inside his mind does not prove that the idea is true. Many ideas may enter a man's mind which are false. But if a man believes what he has to believe, if he is not free to test his beliefs against reality and to validate or reject them, if the actions and content of his mind are determined by factors that may or may not have anything to do with reason, logic, and reality, then he can never know if his conclusions are true or false. Knowledge is the correct identification of the facts of reality. And in order for man to know that the contents of his mind do constitute knowledge, in order for him to know that he has identified the facts of reality correctly, he requires a means of testing his conclusions. The means is the process of reasoning, of testing his conclusions against reality and checking for contradictions. It is thus that he validates his conclusions. But this validation is possible only if his capacity to judge is free. That is, non-conditional, given a normal brain state. But if his capacity to judge is not free, there is no way for a man to discriminate between his beliefs and those of a raving lunatic. But then how do the advocates of determinism acquire their knowledge? What is its validation? Determinists are conspicuously silent on this point. If the advocates of determinism insist that their choice to think and their acceptance of reason is conditional, dependent on factors outside their control, which means that they are not free to test their beliefs against the facts of reality, then they cannot claim to know that their theory is true. They can only report that they feel helpless to believe otherwise. Nor can they claim that their theory is highly probable. They can only acknowledge the inner compulsion that forbids them to doubt that it is highly probable. Some advocates of determinism, evidently sensing this epistemological dilemma, have sought to escape it by asserting that, although they are determined to believe what they believe, the factor determining them is logic. But by what means do they know this? Their beliefs are no more subject to their control than a lunatic's. They and the lunatic are equally the pawn of deterministic forces. Both are incapable of judging their judgments. One of the defining characteristics of psychosis is loss of volitional control over rational judgment. But according to determinism, that is man's normal metaphysical state. There is no escape from determinism's epistemological dilemma. A mind that is not free to test and validate its conclusions, a mind whose judgment is not free, can have no way to tell the logical from the illogical, no way to ascertain that which compels and motivates it, no right to claim knowledge of any kind. Such a mind is disqualified for such appraisals by its very nature. The very concept of logic is possible only to a volitional consciousness. An automatic consciousness could have no need of it and could not conceive of it. The concepts of logic, thought, and knowledge are not applicable to machines. A machine does not reason. It performs the actions its builder sets it to perform, and those actions alone. If it is set to register that 2 + 2 = 4, it does so. If it is set to register that 2 + 2 = 5, it does so. It has no power to correct the orders and information given it. If self-correctors are built into it, it performs the prescribed acts of self-correction and no others. If the self-correctors are set incorrectly, it cannot correct itself. It cannot make any independent, self-generated contribution to its own performance. If man, who is clearly not set invariably to be right, were merely a super-complex machine engineered by his heredity and operated by his environment, pushed, pulled, shaped, and molded by his genes, his toilet training, his parental upbringing, and his cultural history, then no premise reached by him could claim objectivity or truth, including the premise that man is a machine. If, as staunch determinist such as Baron Holbach states in his work System of Nature, man's, quote, ideas come to him involuntarily, close quote, if man is, quote, wise or foolish, reasonable or irrational, without his will being for anything in these various states, close quote, then by what right does he or any other determinist claim his involuntary ideas as knowledge? A determinist can only announce, destiny forces me to believe, etc. He cannot claim to know anything. Those who expound determinism must either assert that they arrived at their theory by mystical revelation and thus exclude themselves from the realm of reason, or they must assert that they are an exception to the theory they propound and thus exclude their theory from the realm
I feel like
of
he's
truth.
smuggled in non-standard definitions of knowledge and truth. That I don't think his definition. Hold on, let me land here. Crash freighter. He's saying that like my computer could be said to know my password. It has knowledge of my password. It does not have. It's got obviously a much lower level of consciousness than I do. It probably no consciousness at all would be the most accurate way of describing my computer. I'm just trying to link this back to his conception of free will. He's saying, aha, I don't think that you can have knowledge if you reject a spiritual mechanism of free will. Like he has not provided. It seems like we're just kind of off into some kind of red herring or something. Like there's only two situations. I'm motioning with my VR hands. How surreal for a discussion on free will. If he's saying that free will exists, then I should be able to ask him, okay, describe the mechanism by which you decide to focus your will or not. Describe the mechanism. Describe the mechanism of free will. It's a god of the gaps, is what I found for most of my research. To go into an epistemological discussion on whether or not we can know something, I mean, that is obviously a significant challenge in all of science, right? That's why we have the scientific method, and we don't just depend on the unilateral declarations of one scientist to make major decisions on, because obviously they could be wrong, they could be biased, they could be manipulated, they could be psycho, like he's saying, they could be crazy, they could be insane. We form hypotheses, we test those hypotheses against reality using sensors and mechanisms and tests that we try to make as objective as possible. We then have those tests hopefully replicated by other people outside of our consciousness that can, hopefully follow the same methods. And if enough tests start succeeding and no countermanding tests are developed, then we start to call that true. He started talking about knowing something to be true, like understanding or knowing truth, and knowing and possessing knowledge, knowing that we know, without defining what knowing and knowledge and truth is. So my definition of truth, I guess my favorite definition of truth, is that it's something that conforms to reality. It's both internally consistent and it conforms to observable reality, or is not contradicted by observation or by reality. So, I mean, this is just I'm just describing the scientific method. I'm not doing anything magical here. And so, this is how we try to get as close as possible to truth. This is how we try to get as close as possible to quote-unquote knowledge. So I'm probably going to rewind this one more time, and so I'm sorry if you guys have been on the stream for a while, but I think this is finally, we're getting close to the crux of this issue, so I'm going to rewind this one more time just a little bit.
There's no power to correct the orders and information given it.
And making sure I'm not missing
validate
something.
Its conclusions. A mind whose judgment is not free can have no way to tell the logical from the illogical, no way to ascertain that which compels and motivates it, no right to claim knowledge of any kind. Such a mind is disqualified for such appraisals by its very nature.
A mind that is not free cannot evaluate if something is logical or illogical? My computer, it's not even sentient, can evaluate if something is logical or illogical. Like if I type in a divided by 0, if I type in is a equal to a, these are simple logical statements that can be coded for in the hardware, so to speak, in the software or hardware, or the software running on the hardware, to evaluate such things. There's certainly no sentience there. There's no, volition in the way that he uses the term. So I'm not following this argument yet, but let's keep going.
The very concept of logic is possible only to a volitional consciousness. An automatic consciousness could have no need of it and could not conceive of it.
I mean, he's making these statements, but he's not proving them.
The concepts of logic, thought, and knowledge are not applicable to machines. A machine does not reason. It performs the actions its builder sets it to perform.
Depends on how you define reason.
If it is set to register that 2 + 2 = 4, it does so. If it is set to register that 2 + 2 = 5, it does so. It has no power to correct the orders and information given it. If self-correctors are built into it, it performs the prescribed acts of self-correction and no others. If the self-correctors are set incorrectly, it cannot correct itself. It cannot make any independent, self-generated contribution to its own performance. If man, who is clearly not set invariably to be right, were merely a super-complex machine engineered by his heredity and operated by his environment, pushed, pulled, shaped, and molded by his genes, his toilet training, his parental upbringing, and his cultural history, then no premise reached by him could claim objectivity or truth, including the premise that man is a machine. If, as staunch determinist such as Baron Holbach states in his work System of Nature, man's, quote, ideas come to him involuntarily, close quote, if man is, quote, wise or foolish, reasonable or irrational, without his will being for anything in these various states, close quote, then by what right does he or any other determinist claim his involuntary ideas as knowledge? A determinist can only announce,
I guess it
destiny forces me to believe, etc.
depends on what you mean by
Cannot
knowledge.
claim to know anything. Those who expound determinism must either assert that they arrived at their theory by mystical revelation, and thus exclude themselves from the realm of reason, or they must assert that they are an exception to the theory they propound, and thus exclude their theory from the realm of truth.
Okay, bold statement. Now show me why that's true.
That knowledge is possible to man cannot be contested without self-contradiction. It is a truth that must be accepted even in the act of seeking to dispute it. Any theory that necessitates the conclusion that man can know nothing is self-invalidating and self-refuting by that very fact. Yet such is the conclusion to which the theory of determinism inescapably leads. Thus, a rationally espoused determinism is a contradiction in terms. In appraising any theory of the nature of man's mind and its operations, it is necessary to consider this. Since the theory is itself a product of man's mind, its claim to truth must be compatible with its own existence and content. Otherwise, the theory is contradictory and nonsensical. For example, if a man were to declare as an alleged fact of reality, man is incapable of knowing any facts, the logical absurdity of his statement would be obvious. The epistemological contradiction of determinism is, in a subtler and more complex way, of the identical order. Determinism is a theory whose claim to truth is incompatible with its own contents. It exhibits what may be termed the fallacy of self-exclusion. It does not matter whether man's mind is alleged to be passively under the sway of the laws of association, or of conditioned reflexes, or of environmental pressures, or of original sin. Any theory of mind that denies man's volitional control over his faculty of judgment collapses under the weight of the same inescapable and insuperable contradiction.
Okay, but you have to say how. You can't just keep saying it does.
Only because man is a being of volitional consciousness, only because he is free to initiate and sustain a reasoning process, is knowledge, in contradistinction to irresistible, unchosen beliefs, possible to him.
Hey guys, this is Patrick from the future. When I was editing this video, I was kind of listening back, and I'm not sure the commentary I just made on what he was saying was entirely accurate, so I just wanted to insert some additional thoughts that came to mind as I was listening to this while editing. He says that with a deterministic mind, meaning a mind that follows the laws of physics and, the brain operates according to the rules of this universe, so to speak, that we can't come to know anything, because I think he's saying that you can't test a hypothesis without free will. You can't compare a hypothesis to reality without free will. So if you're operating on a deterministic set of code, let's say, you can't know anything. You can't evaluate the truth or falsehood. You can't compare something to reality in an objective way, because you're going to believe whatever your code tells you to believe. I think this is false for a couple reasons. The first reason I would say is Imagine a multimeter. This is a tool that circuit board specialists and electricians and anybody dealing with electricity uses. It's a tool that can measure voltage. It can measure something called continuity. Let's say this is where, you put your leads on either side of a circuit and it will beep if it detects an electrical connection between those 2 points. And it will not beep if it doesn't detect an electrical connection between those 2 points. This tool is testing reality in an objective way, in a deterministic way. It has software running on its hardware that allows it to compare a hypothesis. This is a circuit, or this is not a circuit. This, lead A connects to lead B, and it compares that hypothesis to reality in an objective, deterministic way. If it didn't do that, it would be unable to have the knowledge of whether or not that electrical connection existed. If it wasn't deterministic, if it didn't function on the laws of reality, it couldn't compare a hypothesis to reality. If it didn't function the same way every time, in a reliable, repeatable, deterministic fashion, it would be unable to test that hypothesis against reality, is what I'm saying. So in a way, it seems like the correct position here is almost the opposite of what this guy's saying. Without determinism, can you know anything? I think is a better question. How can you know anything without the system of finding knowledge being based in an objective reality, following objective rules? It would seem that you would have to start there to know something. You can't start from subjectivity. So the opposite of objectivity is subjectivity, meaning a system that can change based on unknown rules. You can change like feelings versus logic is a good example. Logic will dictate the answer in the same way every time the equation is run, whereas feelings might change from moment to moment, day to day. One is sort of dependable and deterministic, and the other one is subjective and undependable and changing and malleable and not based on anything objective. So if I want to test the continuity of a circuit, I wouldn't turn to anything that wasn't objective. I wouldn't turn to something malleable and subjective and something that could change from moment to moment on a whim or a feeling. I don't see how you can have knowledge without determinism. And the other thing I want to insert here, maybe the second thought from the future, is that listening to this back, he's raising this as some kind of insurmountable problem with believing that, our consciousness runs on hardware that exists in reality. So he's effectively saying that that can't be the case. But he's not pointing to what is the case. He's not pointing to how it does work. He's not telling us the actual functional machine that operates behind free will. How are decisions made? If decisions can't be made using an objective system that doesn't change and isn't whimsical, then decisions truly can't be trusted, can't be considered objective, can't ever be considered to have found truth or knowledge. This whole line feels like some kind of strange digression that is used to say, well, you're wrong, I don't know the actual answer, but that's not it, while also ignoring that it kind of defeats his own position. Our senses have the capacity for accuracy. Doesn't mean that they're always accurate. It means that they can be accurate. And our reason has the capacity for objectivity. Not always so. Certainly somebody can reason their way into a very poor conclusion. Certainly people can use invalid reason. Their reason engine can misfunction or be used improperly. But it has the capacity for accurate, objective reason, logical thought. This is why we have the scientific method. But again, I don't want to repeat things that I've already said to you. I just wanted to kind of bungee back into this video with a couple of follow-on thoughts that I've had on this discussion. Again, I'm probably going to continue having new thoughts after this video is posted, so I want this to be considered like a continuing discussion. I'm not giving you my conclusions. Like I said in the beginning, we are learning together here. And I kind of hope I'm wrong still, but we'll see.
Now, there is one common confusion which, in the minds of many people, allows them to grant some validity to the thesis of psychological determinism. And that is the confused and entirely mistaken notion that the law of causality requires commitment to psychological determinism. It does not. I recall to your memory our discussion of causality in Lecture 3. The actions of an entity are determined by the nature of the entity that acts. It is the nature of the entity that determines the actions possible to it, and in any given context or situation, it is the nature of the entity which determines what the entity will do. Man's unique biological character, or one of the unique characteristics biologically of man, is precisely this self-regulatory power over his own consciousness, which was discussed earlier. This capacity to generate a certain kind of mental action. When we say that man is a being of volitional consciousness, we are recognizing this particular self-regulatory capacity which man possesses, and that is one of the crucial characteristics of the kind of entity man is. Man's nature is such that it confronts him with a choice which he cannot escape, which only he can make. It is not made for him by his environment or his destiny or by any external force, past or present. That is the unique responsibility which nature poses to this one species, a responsibility regarding directing the action of his consciousness. And what I want to draw to your attention, as I discussed in the earlier section of tonight's lecture, what I want you to see in this self-regulatory power of man over his consciousness is an extension of a biological principle which, on lower levels, we can see running through all forms of life, namely, in what respect life always entails self-regulated action. Here, we get a regulation concerning the action of consciousness itself, a regulation which is volitional in nature.
Hey, Patrick from the future here again. Just all sorts of, I've had time to sleep on this. All sorts of new thoughts are happening while listening to this back while editing it for you. I think what he's saying is that most all decisions are deterministic, determined by environment and upbringing and blah, 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 genetics, brain physiology. Like he's taking all normal decisions outside of a single type of decision. And he's saying, okay, that's all deterministic. But this one special type of decision, the decision to focus one's mind, to focus one's consciousness, this is a special kind of decision. This decision is not made deterministically. This decision is not, this choice is somehow outside of reality. This choice is not made by something running on your brain hardware. To which the question has to be asked. What the hell is running this particular decision? And why is this particular decision running on some other platform? Where does this platform exist? Because if it's in this reality, it behaves according to this reality's rules. If it exists in some other reality, it's still going to be deterministic according to that reality's rules. Or it's totally random, which I think we disproved in the beginning. Like if it's truly random, then we'd be making random decisions, which we clearly don't make random decisions.
Now, many people still think when they think of causality in terms of a highly limited model of causality, and that is the Newtonian mechanistic model. And that is a central cause of confusion in attempting to think about human psychology. Meaning by that the following. They think of the universe as a vast billiard table, as it were, as though everything is only moved by being knocked by something else. Now, this concept is utterly inadequate to account for living phenomena in general, let alone for man. Implicit in this notion of causality is a radically different notion of causality than the Greeks advocated or that we discussed in Lecture 3. The Greeks, such as Aristotle in particular, when they conceived causality, correctly understood it in terms of a relationship between entities and actions. A disastrous confusion in the conceiving of causality emerged in the post-Renaissance period when men began to conceive of causal relations not in terms of relationships between entities and actions, but in terms of relationships between actions and other actions. They saw every action as being only a reaction to something else. They assumed implicitly, to begin with, that the normal or natural state of entities, left to their own devices as it were, is rest, is stillness, that motion always reflects the impingement of some outside force upon an object or entity which otherwise would be still, and hence later on this became known as the billiard ball view of the universe. And when we attempt to use this kind of a model to life in general and to human beings in particular, of course it is grossly inadequate to explain the facts that we see. You can't even explain the action of a plant with a billiard ball model, let alone the actions of a living consciousness. Aristotle correctly observed that one of the distinguishing characteristics of living organisms as separate from non-living organisms is, as he said, that in living organisms the source or origin of their motion lies within themselves. If a plant grows, it's not because something outside pushed it. Its principle of motion lies within itself. And here again, we recognize that even before we come to the question of free will or volition or man, that one has to recognize that the mechanistic billiard ball approach to causal explanation is very limited. It has relevance to many aspects of life, but it's by no means synonymous with what is meant by the concept of causality in the abstract or in general.
All right, sir, I'm going to need you to make a point pretty soon, please. Thank you. Appreciate
When
it.
you say, or as you will almost certainly say to me in the question period tonight, yes, Mr. Brandon, this is all very well, but just the same, what makes one person focus his mind and another person not focus?
That's closer to what I'm asking.
What you are implicitly thinking of is what sort of force pushed man's mind in the direction of thinking or of evading.
Yeah, that's kind of what I asked
In other words,
earlier.
you will be thinking that every action is only a reaction, and you want to know a reaction to what? To what force, will be asking me, is thinking a reaction?
Because if
That's
it's not
where
a
you have to
reaction to
check your
something,
premise.
it's spiritual.
That is the premise that you have to check. I'm glad
Okay,
to see so
good.
many heads nodding.
I'm glad he's
This is a
identified
very
where I'm at.
important point of
Now,
confusion
please tell me
of
where I'm
Mr.
wrong.
Free Will.
Please.
The choice to focus or not to focus is a causal primary. It does not have causal antecedents in the same way that other choices, such as the choice to go to movie A rather than movie B, obviously have them.
So it's
This
magical.
I discussed earlier. It is a primary category characteristic of the human species, a primary power or capacity.
Power
And
or
if you are tempted
capacity?
to say, yes, but what made one man think and another man evade? If you find it psychologically or epistemologically or metaphysically unacceptable to hold the view that this was a choice made by him which is causally irreducible in the sense in which no antecedent force drove him to it, then you can only do so from the implicit premise, held consciously and usually not consciously, that, to repeat, every mental action must be a reaction to something else. Why? The piece of dogma which you have to challenge in that notion is that nothing can originate action or originate motion.
So I'd like to compare what we just heard him say with Newton's first and second laws of motion. Law 1. Every body persists in its state of being at rest or of moving uniformly straight forward, except insofar as it is compelled to change its state by force impressed. Stated differently, the first law states that if the net force is 0, then the velocity of the object is constant. Said another way, an object will not move unless something external to it applies forces to the object. Law number 2, the alteration of motion is ever proportional to the motive force impressed and is made in the direction of the right line in which that force is impressed. Stated another way, the second law is that the rate of change of momentum of a body is directly proportional to the force applied, and this change in momentum takes place in the direction of the applied force. This means that an object will only move to the degree it is moved. Stated yet another way, the first law of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of energy, states that the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. So if we take the isolated system to be the entire universe, then the total amount of energy in that universe remains constant, and the objects inside of it merely interact with each other and trade energy back and forth. So for him to say that there cannot be any new motion that comes from nothing, some new action that stems from nowhere that was not initiated by an input of force from an outside source, doesn't seem to conform to the knowledge that we have of reality.
Now, although throughout history there have been many different forms of determinism, a form which is particularly prevalent today is, of course, the variety called environmentalism. Let's very, very briefly, since we're running short on time, say a few words about this issue. This is the claim, environmentalism, that man is primarily the passive product of his background and environment. It is environment, modern psychologists assert, that determines man's character, values, action, and thinking. Man is only a walking recorder into which his parents, teachers, and neighbors dictate what they please. Such parents, teachers, and neighbors themselves being only walking recorders, carrying the dictations of other earlier recorders, and so forth. As to where new ideas, concepts, and values come from, this question such theorists leave unanswered. Or sometimes they go so far as to say there are no new ideas. Now, the general fallacy in the concept of determinism has already been stated, but let us consider a little more specifically this variety. His environment, the facts of the world around him, offer man material about which to think, but they do not determine the content of his thinking. Your perceptual experiences do not lead you to your conceptual conclusions by some passive deterministic process, as though the particular combination of percepts that you had can lead you only in one direction. This demonstrably is false. Perceptions don't have the power to transform themselves into convictions without an intervening mental process which you have to initiate and direct, namely the process of thinking. Man's life and character are determined then not by the things he perceives, but by the thinking he does or fails to do about the things that he perceives. If, for instance, a child is brought up by irrational parents who give him a bewildering, frightening, and contradictory impression of reality, he may decide that all human beings by their nature are incomprehensible and dangerous to him. And if he arrests his thinking at this point, and if in later years he never attempts to think this issue through again, never attempts to question his chronic feeling of anxiety and helplessness, he can spend the rest of his life in a state of embittered paralysis. But such does not have to be his fate. If he continues to struggle with this problem, or as he grows older, if he decides to think about it, to re-examine it, to consider the newer, wider evidence available to him, if, to put the issue more simply, he decides to preserve an acute mental focus, he can discover that he has made an unwarranted generalization, and he can then revise it into a fully reasoned and conscious conviction. Another child in the same circumstances may draw a different conclusion. He may decide that all human beings are unreliable and evil, and that he will beat them at their own game. He will act as ruthlessly and dishonestly as possible to hurt them before they hurt him. Again, he can revise this conclusion later in the light of wider evidence, if he chooses to think about it, if he chooses to remain in focus. If he doesn't, he will become a scoundrel or a criminal, not because his parents were irrational, but because he defaulted on the responsibility of remaining in focus, of forming his convictions in full consciousness, and of checking his conclusions against the facts of reality. A third child in the same circumstances may decide that his parents are wrong, that they are unjust and unfair, or at least that they do not act understandably, and that he must not act as they do. He may suffer at home, but keep looking for evidence of better human behavior among relatives or neighbors or in books and movies. Such a child will draw an enormous advantage out of his misfortune, which he will not realize till many, many years later. He will have laid the foundation of an inviolate self-esteem. If an adolescent grows up in a neighborhood where crime flourishes and cynically is accepted as the normal, he can, abdicating the independence of his judgment, allow his character to be shaped in the image of the prevailing values and become a criminal himself. Or, choosing to think, choosing to remain aware, choosing to go on looking at the facts of reality and to make sense out of what he sees, he will come to the realization of the irrationality and humiliating self-degradation of the people who accept a criminal's mode of existence. Of any value offered to him as the right, and any assertion offered to him as the true, a human being is free to ask why. And that why is the threshold that the beliefs of others cannot cross without his consent. But what of the individual who does appear to be the product of his background, the pawn of his conditioning? Well, let's take the social worker's favorite example. Let's consider the case of the boy who, brought up in a bad neighborhood, becomes a criminal. What are the internal mental processes that lead this poor chap into a life of crime? Very briefly, the pattern goes like this. In the actions of a boy who allows himself in this manner to be shaped by his environment, an obvious motive activating him is the desire to swim with the current. What in psychological terms does this expression mean? What does it mean to swim with the current? The boy is living in a neighborhood where crime and hoodlumism is rampant, and he swims with the current. Well, how does this happen? To swim with the current proceeds from the desire to escape the effort and responsibility of initiating one's own course of action. In order to choose one's own actions, one has, of course, to choose one's own goals. And to do that, one has to choose one's own values. And to do that, one has to think. One has to be in focus. one has to go on looking and judging. Thinking is the first and the basic responsibility that such a boy rejects. And because he doesn't choose to think and has therefore no long-range goals or standards, he is left at the mercy of the impulses of the immediate moment. He is forced to pursue short-range, immediately available goals and to seek immediately available pleasures. And this leads him, in the logic of his course, to accept whatever values are offered to him by whatever social group happens to surround him. To swim with the current, one has to accept the ocean or the swamp or the rapids or the cesspool or the abyss toward which that particular current is rushing. Having no values or standards of his own, the boy will want to swim. He will want to follow any course of action ready-made for him by others. He will want to belong. If the boys in the neighborhood form a gang at the corner pool room, he will join. If they start robbing people, he will start robbing people. If they begin to murder, he will murder. What moves him? His feelings. His feelings are all he has left once he has abandoned his mind. He does not join the gang by a conscious reasoned decision. He doesn't think it out and decide it's a logical thing to do. No. He joins because he feels like joining.
What?
He does not follow the gang because he thinks they are right. No. He follows because he feels like following.
There is reasoning to join a gang. It might be bad reasoning, but it's still reasoning.
He does not weigh her arguments.
It seems like he's saying that every bad, like every illogical or poorly reasoned decision is
just doesn't feel like
not reason, it's just feels.
If at some point he begins to fear that the gang may be going too far, if he is anxious at the prospect of becoming a murderer, he realizes that the alternative is to break with his friends and be left on his own. He does not weigh the advantages or disadvantages of being left on his own. No, he chooses blindly to stick with the gang. Because at the prospect of being alone, at the prospect of independence, he feels terror. He may see across the river.
I guess he's just not aware of the reasons people join gangs.
A totally different kind of life, and boys of his own age who somehow did not become criminals. But this does not raise in his mind the question of whether a better kind of life may be possible to him. It does not prompt him to inquire or investigate, because he feels terror at the unknown. He feels safe in his surroundings. They are the familiar and the known. If he asks himself what it is that terrifies him about breaking with his background, well, he would answer in effect, I don't know nobody out there, and nobody knows me.
What?
In logic, this isn't an answer or an explanation, because there is nothing objectively terrifying in that statement.
Really seems like we're falling off here.
It satisfies him because he feels an overwhelming, unanalyzed dread of loneliness.
What?
And feelings are his only absolute.
What if he needs protection? What if he thinks it's the only way to get money or resources or be successful?
Bloody and senselessly wanton.
There are neighborhoods where you have to have protection.
And that he never had the chance. Will he scream it because it is true? No. He will scream it because he feels it. In the sense opposite to that which he intends, there is one element of truth in his scream. Given his basic policy of anti-thought, he could not help it, and he never did have a chance. Neither has any other human being who moves through life on that policy. But it is not true that he or any other human being could not help running from the necessity
I feel like
to think
we've moved on to a new topic or something.
On his feelings. On every day of this boy's life, and at every crucial turning point, the possibility of thinking about his actions was open to him. The evidence on which to base a change in his policy was available to him, and he evaded it. He didn't care to think. If at every turning point he had thought carefully and conscientiously and had simply reached the wrong conclusions, he would be more justified in crying that he could not help it. But ladies and gentlemen, it is not helplessly bewildered, conscientious thinkers who fill reform schools and murder one another on street corners through an unfortunate error in logic.
That's bad logic right there. All day. All right, how much longer we got of this? I think we're done with the good stuff. We got 5 minutes left. We'll wait him out.
Upon which this boy proceeded
5 minutes. Let's
is
do
the
it.
policy on which many people proceed. He perhaps carried it to more of an extreme, or existed in an environment where that policy would prove more disastrous. Not that he never thinks. Oh no, everybody thinks some of the time. His policy is, I'll think when I feel like thinking. It's an unfair charge to say that some people never think at all. Nobody is ever out of focus all the time. When we say a person is out of focus, characteristically, we're talking about a person whose feelings largely determine whether he's in focus or out of focus. Certainly not reality. But thinking is not a luxury in which man indulges if and when his feelings permit it. The relationship is the opposite. Feelings take over and assert control if and when thinking is suspended. And this is the manner in which men can be determined, in quotes, by their environment. If a man chooses not to think, if he chooses to escape from the effort of focus and the responsibility of judgment, he is left at the mercy of his feelings, of his immediate subconscious reactions, and these will be at the mercy of the outside forces impinging upon him, at the mercy of whoever and whatever is around him. In this state, he is a helpless zombie passively being shaped by his environment. But he did not have to get into that state, and he does not have to remain in it. He still has the power to focus, to think, to question, and if he chooses not to, then it is he who has turned himself into the determinist view of man, that is, into an empty mold waiting to be filled, into a will-less robot waiting to be taken over by any environment and any conditioners. Most human beings, to conclude, most human beings, as I have said, are not unequivocally opposed to the policy of thinking. It would be more correct to say that thinking for most men is sort of an emergency measure. It's what you try when everything else has failed, which is usually much too late. It's a sort of a last resort. The first resort is to act on your immediate impulses or feelings, or habits, or advice that somebody gives you. If that proves inadequate to the whole situation, or if it mangles you, at some point, some men decide implicitly, well, just for the hell of it, I'll try to think my way out of this situation. At which, much of the time, they find they can't. And small wonder. Can't in the time necessary, that is. They could, but what could have been a task of minutes or weeks becomes a task of agonizing years if it's undertaken at all. Because they don't have the knowledge which they should have to help them in this moment, the knowledge that would have come from the thinking they didn't do. The unfortunate state of affairs is that psychologists, when they see this sort of spectacle, should be the first to point out the deadly danger of the policy of men who try to exist with as little thinking as they can get away with. But much of psychology, instead of criticizing this policy, instead of pointing out that it's a sign on the road to disease and disaster, no, instead they say, such is human nature. Man is only peripherally and marginally a rational being. They say that it's far more relevant to say that he's a feeling being, and they point to all of the wrecks in their offices as evidence. but it's not in the therapist's office that you find out what human nature is. And you don't point to neurotics and psychotics as examples of normal human functioning or behavior. This leads us very directly into the lectures of the next several weeks. Next week, Mrs. Brandon will be the guest lecturer, and as you know, she will deal specifically with the psychology of thinking, with the principles of efficient thinking. And in the following 2 weeks, I will be concerned to show you what the issue of thinking or non-thinking has to do with the issue of mental health. And from there into the subject of ethics and morality. So, to be continued next week. Thank you.
Okay, well, we made it through. I personally remain, unfortunately, unconvinced. And I say unfortunately very genuinely. I really wanted to be convinced. I am happy if somebody in the comments thinks I missed something. Something about the importance of being able to know, in whatever definition he was using the term. Something important in the way that it seemed like he attempted to address my exact problem, which was like, what is the mechanism by which you decide to focus your attention? And I guess the last thing I'll say in this area, Commander Data from Star Trek came to mind while I was listening to this, and to get around much of what he was talking about, I won't even say that. I'll just say, okay, let's just consider Data for a moment as a thought experiment. You have a highly advanced computer that's able to perceive things. It has software running on its hardware that's able to categorize things automatically, much in the same way that we have software running and that handles that automatically for us. And Data also had the ability to self-modify. He had the ability to modify his quote-unquote programming. So if his current programming found that his decision-making, his perceptions, his thought process, his logic, his categorizations did not conform with reality, did not produce the results that they were intending or that they were desiring based on the goals that, his programming selected, that he could modify his programming so as to achieve better results in the future. And then from that point, the modifications become the new software, and future decisions ongoing are made according to the new software running on his hardware. And this process can iterate. I think the question is, I need somebody to take my finger, my philosophical brain-mind finger, and point it to the difference between a human brain's hardware that is running on... This is a really pretty planet. Look at this. I think this is going to be home, even with the storms. At least the best home so far. I'll land and drop a base. So I need somebody to oh shit. Oh, damn, wasn't paying attention. So I need somebody to take my finger, my brain finger, and touch it to the difference between a human mind and a positronic network that is Data's brain. We both have software running on hardware that exists in reality and obeys physical laws of nature. Objective laws of nature, deterministic laws of nature. And guys, please believe me when I tell you, a year ago, I had a very negative reaction to the idea of any kind of determinism. And even to this day, this is not a position that I defend with any pleasure. I'm only defending this position because I have not yet defeated it. So please take my finger, put it on what defeats this. What is the difference? What is the magic goo that sits in between the hardware of our mind and the software running on that hardware and the decisions that we make? And what is the nature? How does that device function? Whatever that device is, I want you to show it to me, and I want you to describe to me how it works in a way that isn't bound by deterministic laws of reality. Because what you're going to be describing necessarily, definitionally, has to be supernatural. And I'm, guys, so happy to be wrong here. If you think I'm wrong, if you know how I'm wrong, please tell me. It will be welcome knowledge. It will be a welcome debate. It will be a welcome discussion. I am here. I am open to it. And if you have some more content you'd like me to review, please submit that to me. All right, guys. I'm going to continue the live stream. So for those that want to subscribe to us over on Twitch or on DLive, you'll be notified when these live streams go live and we play games and have a good time.
Hey guys, this is Patrick from the double future. This is Patrickception. We are 3 levels deep now. I wanted to jump back in. I had one final thought. It was a contradiction that I didn't catch the first time or the second time through this video that I wanted to point out in what that guy was saying. He said that most all decisions, are not the same as the choice to focus one's consciousness. He said that the free will is involved in this one type of choice, the choice to focus consciousness. But earlier, when he was talking about whether or not we could have knowledge without free will, or without volitional existence, I guess, he was kind of, back then he was talking about free will as if it involved all decisions. And certainly you can imagine a scenario where, like, let's say that you deterministically forced someone to focus their consciousness, but then gave them true free will with all other decisions. They could certainly go about testing hypotheses in relation to reality and forming knowledge. If the second thing he said was true, is that the only actual free will decision is the choice to focus consciousness, therefore, if you don't believe that, then you can't have knowledge, that it's a contradiction. Because the choices that are involved in evaluating reality and gaining knowledge is not the choice to focus the consciousness, it's the choices to evaluate objectively sense data, or to follow processes that help us evaluate sense data objectively, is a better way of saying that. Okay, and with that, I will close the video. Thanks for watching this rather long one. Please, again, let me know in the comments if you like it, if you want to see more of these, or if you have something that you suggest that I watch. And again, please let me know if I'm wrong. Thanks for watching.